Hello, and welcome to the first of two lectures in the Business Process Design and Analysis area. In this first lecture, Business Process Fundamentals, we're going to define the domain of business process management, and we're going to look at three different approaches to mapping business processes. Now, we've already talked about manufacturing and service processes in this course, and we've talked about some of the pros and cons and trade-offs associated with different choices. For instance, when would you use a job shop manufacturing process versus an assembly line, or when you might have a service factory versus a professional service. In this lecture, we're going to step back and look more broadly at how firms manage business processes. That's the domain of business process management piece. And then we're going to look at how they actually identify the different sets of activities that have to take place. That's the process mapping piece. So let's step back and give a definition of business processes. Broadly speaking, business processes are logically related sets of tasks or activities geared towards some business outcome. Because of that, they can include manufacturing activities, service activities, or some mix of both. What makes business processes really interesting from our perspective is that they're often involve crossing functional boundaries. To give you an example, if you order a textbook from Amazon.com, then you have to interface with the financial area of the company, Amazon. You have to interface with the operations area, the folks who control inventory and warehousing, and you'll have to also interface with the marketing or sales side. So order fulfillment at Amazon.com involves cross-functional linkages of activities, and that makes it a challenge to manage. In addition to being defined by logically related sets of activities or tasks, business processes can be divided into three different types: primary processes, support processes, and developmental processes. Think about primary processes as being those that provide a product or service that the customer is willing to pay money for. For instance, making the product or treating a patient are primary processes. Support processes, on the other hand, are things that the business has to do to survive, but it isn't necessarily something that the customer is paying for directly. To illustrate, if a customer buys a product, if a customer asks you to make a product for them, then you have to bill them for it. It's not that billing is what the customer wants, but it's a necessary part of the business. So sometimes support processes are called business value added. There's a third type of activity or process called developmental. These are things that happen offline, and as the name implies, they develop the skills and capabilities and technological knowledge that the company needs to carry out the primary and support processes. And this can include R&D, testing, etc. The point is, in all three of these cases, we have to think about how we design these processes, who's involved with it, how we measure performance, etc. Okay, the term business process management, or BPM, has been around for quite a while, and depending on who you talk about, you can get different definitions of what BPM is. The model I'm showing here is a pyramid model put forth by Paul Harmon in around 2007, and I think it does a good job talking about the implications and challenges of business process management. Let's start at the business process level, because that's probably the one we're most intuitively comfortable with. Here we are focusing on the design and improvement of a specific business process. Let's say we're talking about a manufacturer and we're making sunglasses. We can think about the different steps necessary to carry out the production of those sunglasses, what volume, what variety of sunglasses we're making. We can think about how materials will be passed on, how we'll maintain quality, etc., etc. So we can actually define that primary business process for making those sunglasses. And that's where we get into such issues as what are the specific activities involved, how do we improve the process. Maybe we want to take on a Six Sigma project to improve it. Maybe we want to document how this process works so we can pass it on to other organizations, or we can maintain control over it. But in any case, it tends to be a very tactical perspective. Here's a business process, here's how it works, here's how inputs come into it, here's how outputs go out of it. But that's only one level of the business process management task. At a higher level of the organization, what we call the enterprise level, there's got to be some kind of a focus on developing and supporting a firm-wide process architecture which pulls together and coordinates all these business processes. Think about it this way. If every manager at the tactical level was allowed to develop the business processes he or she is responsible for in whatever way he or she felt was best, it's not at all sure that they would link together properly at the firm level. So at the enterprise level, we've got to have some overarching strategy that guides the development of business processes at a lower level. If we take it a step further in formality, we may even define a process architecture where we make sure the inputs and the outputs of all our processes are linked, that we have the appropriate performance measurement systems in place, and that we have quote-unquote alignment across all the processes. So what we're talking about here at the enterprise level is a fairly high level of centralization and control over how our business processes are developed. And what you also see in that list on the right below process architecture, process measurement, and process management alignment is something called BPM governance. Imagine it working this way. Let's go back to the sunglasses manufacturer. I may be the plant manager responsible for the sunglasses line, but after I've come up with what I think is a pretty good solution for how we should make these sunglasses, I have to bounce that off of a higher group in the organization that says, yes, this does or does not fit in with the strategy of the firm. Well, where are you going to get the materials? How are you going to ship the output? Does the product, does the way you're doing things fit into the grander schemes of the organization? So that BPM governance provides guidance for lower level business process design. Now think about this in the context of the Porter article we read for an earlier lecture. Remember how Porter argued that strategic advantage springs up from all the interlinkages between all the activities that a company puts in place? All those linkages, all those activities make it very difficult to copy what a company does. What BPM is saying here is we can actually guide the development of all those intricate sets of activities and linkages. And alternatively, it could spring up organically, but you get the idea here. We have an enterprise level to keep things in control and focused on the strategy, and we have the business process level. The third level is called the implementation level. And as Paul Harmon describes it, he argues that to put in place business processes and to manage those processes at the enterprise level, we have to have the right people in place and we have to have the right information systems in place. If you look at the HR side of it, then we have to think about the design of the jobs, how we train and develop people with the right sets of skills and the right knowledge to do business process management. On the IT side, we may even have software that encodes the business processes we have. And to give you an idea of where you might have seen this before, think about the SCORE model. The SCORE model, in fact, is a process architecture for companies in the supply chain arena. Now what's happened is some software vendors, a fair number of software vendors, have taken the SCORE model and encoded it in software. So in effect, they've developed what we call BPM software and suites, which encode the process logic within it. So in theory, if we're going to carry out this design and implementation of business processes, and we're going to have them all strategically linked together, it's great if we have the right people in place and we have the right information systems in place. In fact, if the information systems have been developed with alignment in mind, then we can implement the ERP software, the BPM software, and basically help assure alignment. Now, I've taken about 3 minutes to go over a pyramid model that we could spend weeks talking about. But I'm just trying to give you an idea and an appreciation for what goes on when companies start talking about managing the business processes. You need to think about what level is being referred to in discussions. Are we talking about the strategic enterprise level? Or are we talking about putting in place the resources needed to carry it out? Or are we talking about an individual business process and how it works? And again, if you're interested in this area, I encourage you to look at Paul Harmon's book. It's probably about $30 and well worth the investment. Okay, so now that we've had a chance to think about business process management, there's often questions we have when we're talking about a particular process. One question is, at a micro level, what are the steps in the process? What is the performance of the process like? Another question we have is, where are there handoffs between different functional areas or different organizations? That is, if a process crosses functional areas or organizations, then we need to think about how those handoffs occur. A third question that comes up when designing business processes is, how does a customer actually see and interface with a process? And finally, at a macro level, what are the work relationships between different areas of the business? So what we're going to do now is look at 3 different approaches to mapping business processes that address these types of questions. Some of the different mapping approaches we talk about do better on other questions, some do better on other things. So it's a matter of picking the right type of mapping approach. So we're going to start with the easiest mapping approach, called flowcharts. This is probably what most of us are very familiar with, and it involves highly detailed maps that capture the flow of a customer or some other entity through the system. And when developing flowcharts, we really have to address 4 different things, at least. How does an entity enter the system? How does it exit? What are the logical steps and possible routes that the entity can follow when it's in the business process? Where are their key decision points? Where are their delays? Does the process include all the necessary activities, linkages to information systems, or other major processes? Where do we use where do we use flowcharts? Primarily when we're doing process standardization and certification, or when we're involved in diagnosis and continuous improvement efforts, where we have to get into the minutiae of how the process works. Another use for flowcharts is when we're benchmarking against competitors or best in class. Let me give you an example of that. Suppose you are a food service firm and you want to evaluate the process by which you take and fulfill customer orders. You might look at other folks in your specific industry to see how they do it, and that's called competitive benchmarking. Or you might look at some other retailer who maybe you don't compete with directly, but they're known as being a best in class for their particular industry. And you can benchmark your steps against theirs. So in order to do that, in a lot of cases, we have to have these detailed flow charts. The nice thing about flowcharts is they often give us our first clear picture of what are the boundaries of the process. That is, where does it begin and where does it end? What are the major inputs and outputs? What are the precedence relationships, i.e., what is the logical flow through the activities, and where are their buffer locations? That is, where do members, requests, or work in general queue up in the system? If we know where the buffer locations are, then we have one clue to how we can speed up the flow of an entity through the process. In addition, flowcharts often give us our first clear picture of the value added time, throughput times, and yield rates, as well as how information flows through the process. There's a lot of different symbols that are used in doing flow charting. In reality, for this class, we're going to spend nearly all our time using the rectangles, which stand for a process, task, or activity, and decision points, maybe even delay symbols. A lot of these symbols over here come from the old days of programming when we were developing the information system to support a process. But really for our purposes, because of the type of class we're in, because of our level of interest, if we can capture the logical flow of the process, that'll be fine with us. And so we're going to use a relatively limited set of symbols. Okay, so what are the basic steps to putting together a flow chart? Again, we've got to identify what the boundaries are and what the starting and ending points are, and we've got to say so. Otherwise, we'll have a process map that never ends. And I've seen this before in businesses. I've actually remember looking at one company who had a new product development flow chart, and I couldn't tell where the ideas came from. It just kind of appeared out of nowhere, and it was unclear when the new product development process ended as well. It was a terrible map. They had no clear boundaries or starting and ending points on it. The second thing we have to be sure of when we're putting together a flow chart is to identify the entity that will serve as the focal point. If it's a customer order flowing through the system, then it should be clear as time goes on how that order moves through the system. Alternatively, if it's an actual person, we need to be clear on that. What you don't want is a flow chart where the entity moving through the system changes from one form to another without any reason why. And the third thing I want to point out is keep flowcharts as simple as possible. Don't add detail that doesn't add insight. This means in some cases we may not map out every exception condition that can occur, but we try to capture 90-95% of the detail of the process. So another way of looking at that is no more detail than needed, no less than required. And again, there's a little bit of an art to it, but you'll see how it works as we go on. So let me stop yakking about characteristics of the flowcharts, and let's actually do an example. And this is an old example, I'll confess, but it's an easy one to work with, and it involves flowcharting the customer order process at a Raleigh distribution center, or DC for medical supplies. Here's how it worked at the time. The customer, which was a doctor's office or a clinic, would fax an order into the distribution center, which would pick and deliver the order for the items that were in stock. So the doctor's office would be in the Raleigh area, the distribution center would be in the Raleigh area as well. The doctor's office would put a fax in, someone would look at that fax and say, yep, we got these items in stock, or we don't. If the items are in stock, they'd be picked off the shelves and shipped out. So the question becomes, what are the process steps? What is the value added time? And what percentage of the orders are actually handled properly, which we'll call the yield rate. Now, before we do the flow charting example here, you can imagine people in the organization might have some idea of how much time it takes for an order to go through the system or where things can go wrong. But by looking at the detailed steps, we're going to get some better insights. So in fact, we start digging into the depth of this process, and we find out it works like this. Step number one, this is where the process starts and where the customer's order enters. We have a customer fax an order to the DC. 1 out of 25 are lost to transmission errors, so only 24 out of 25 survive the first step. The fax then sits in an inbox for around 2 hours on average, but up to 4, until someone from the internal mail area picks it up. Internal mail then takes about an hour, up to 2 hours, to deliver to the picking area. 1 out of 100 are delivered to the wrong place. So what that means is, out of the faxes that were sitting in the inbox that are picked up, 1 out of 100 doesn't get delivered to the picking area. Once an fax order is delivered to the picking area, it sits in the picking clerk's inbox until it's processed. What the picking clerk does is they look at this fax, they check their inventory system to see if the items are in stock, and if it is, then they give it to a worker to pick. If an item is in stock, the worker picks and packs the order. It takes them about 20 minutes, but up to 45 minutes. Then an inspector comes through and takes 2 minutes to check the order. Even so, 1 out of 200 are still wrong. Finally, a transport firm delivers the order to the customer. So we're talking about a fairly simple process if you think about it. Once we've developed our flow chart, we're going to use it to answer 3 questions. What is the expected throughput time for the process? What is the expected yield rate? And on average, what percentage of the time is value added? So take a few minutes now and use some of the symbols that we showed a couple slides ago to develop a flow chart of this relatively simple process. And once you're done, you can go on in the lecture. Okay, you ready? Here's the flow chart I got. A couple things I want to point out on it. First of all, I have customer faxes order as the starting activity and customer receives order as the ending activity. So here are the boundaries of the process I'm looking at. In addition, I'm talking about the customer order itself. What happens to it as it goes through the system? Another point I want to bring up right now is in setting boundaries on this flow chart, I decided that I'm only going to look at orders in which the items are in stock. So if the items are in stock, I follow through with them. If the items aren't in stock, then we know that's going to kick off some additional activities involving back orders to the Richmond warehouse, etc., etc. Things we're not going to look at in this example. Some other aspects of my flow chart, which you may or may not have used, is I use a dashed line to represent the flow of information. And I used a solid line to show that the order has now been translated into physical goods and they're flowing through the system. I also used the old paper symbol to show that the order is actually being transferred in paper form. I used a D symbol to show delays, and I have a round symbol to show for a quality check, an inspection step. So let's walk through what's happening here. The customer faxes the order, the paper fax is created, but we know that 4% of those orders are lost. The order then sits in the fax inbox from anywhere from 0 to 4 hours, but 2 hours on average. Then internal mail delivers the fax, and that can take anywhere from half an hour to 1.5 hours, but it's 1 hour on average, and we lose 1% of the orders that get to this step. We have another delay in the system where the order sits in the clerk's inbox for anywhere from 0 to 2 hours. Finally, the picking clerk processes the order, and what I'm showing here is that they look at their database of information on inventory levels, and they determine that the item is or is not in stock. If all the items are in stock, then the worker picks the order, 20 minutes on average, inspector checks the order, takes about 2 minutes, and then the transport firm delivers the order, which can take anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, but 2 hours on average. So if we look at that and try to calculate what the average time is, assuming an order gets all the way through the system, takes 2 hours on average here, an hour there, that's 3 hours, another hour delay here, that's 4 hours, 4 hours 5 minutes, 4 hours 25 minutes, 4 hours 27 minutes, 6 hours and 27 minutes. Does that kind of surprise you? That seems like a lot of time. Now, what's the worst that could happen? Well, it could be 4 hours here, 1.5 hours there, that's 5.5 hours, 7.5 hours, 7 hours and 35 minutes. Oh, whatever. It's going to go way over 8 hours, right? It's going to be more than a single shift if you want to look at it that way. So clearly we have a lot of time going through this process. Now, let's go back to the original time estimate we had, which was the average of 6 hours and 27 minutes. How much of that is value-added time? Now, what do we mean by value-added time? Think about value-added time as being something that is a task that the customer is willing to pay you to do. This is a tough one here. One way we might argue this is to say the transport time is value-added time because it saves the customer having to come to the DC, to the distribution center and pick it up themselves. So let's argue that the 2 hours there is value-added time. What about the time picking it off the shelf? I'm not sure. Now we're talking about 20 minutes maybe. I mean, I guess to the extent that the customer doesn't have to go and find it on the shelves, that saves them some time as well. So far we're arguing that 2 hours and 20 minutes of this 6.5 hours roughly is value-added time. Now, here's the one we get into all the time, and every time I teach this, we have debates going back and forth. Is inspection time value-added? Is the 2 minutes an inspector takes to look at this order to make sure it's correct value-added from the customer's perspective? I can argue it both ways. One argument is, yes, it's value-added time because it helps assure that the customer gets what they wanted. Another alternative would be it's not value-added time because the only reason we're having to do the inspection is because we have problems in the process. If we did the job right the first time, we wouldn't have to do this 2 minutes of inspection. So I'll let you think about that one. Okay, so again, I'm making the argument that maybe the delivery time is value added, maybe the time spent picking the products off the shelf is value added, and maybe the inspection time is, so I debate this. What about all this other time? And as you look at that, it really isn't value added because from a customer's perspective, they're not going to pay you more for an item because the order for it sat in a fax inbox or because it was being delivered to someone who would process that order. So we could argue all the time up here, the 2 hours plus 1 hour, 3 hours plus another hour, 4 hours up here, all this time spent getting that order to the picking clerk is non-value added time. At best, you might argue that roughly about a third of the time spent in this process is value added, though we could go back and forth on that. Okay, so we've talked about average time through the system and how much of that time was maybe value added. What about the yield rate? What is the probability that an order gets through the system perfectly. That is, the order gets through, delivered to the customer, and it's correct. Well, if we look at this, we have 96% of the orders get through this step correctly. 99% of them get through that next step. And then we have 99.5 getting through the picking and inspection area. Correct. So if we take all three of those and multiply those together, 96% times 99% times 99.5%, we get roughly about 95%. Literally what that is telling us is 1 out of 20 orders has been messed up in some way. Now, is that good or bad? Well, think about it this way. If you're the doctor's office and you're ordering medical supplies from this company and you're doing it twice a week, and that means every 10 weeks on average they're screwing it up, you're not going to be terribly happy with that. I would probably argue a 95% yield rate is not very good here. I have a slide here that actually describes how we calculate the process yield rate. Again, it's going to be the percentage of entities that flow through the process with no errors. So if 98% of the customers get what they ordered at a drive-in window and 95% get correct change, one way of calculating process yield rate would be to multiply those two together to get 93.1%. But going back to this example then, we've shown that the process takes on average about 6.5 hours, maybe 2 hours, a little bit more of that than that is value added, so less than a third of the time is value added, and there's a 1 out of 20 chance that your order will be screwed up in some way. There's a 95% yield rate. So think about this process for just a second and tell me what you would do to improve it. What's the simplest thing you can do to improve this process? You probably didn't have to look at this flow chart for long to realize there's one quick solution we could do, which is simply move the fax machine to in front of the picking clerk area or buy a second fax machine. But in any case, if we do that, we eliminate this delay, we eliminate that transport step. Together that pulls about 3 hours out of the process on average and improves the yield rate by about 1%. Alternatively, we could join the 21st century and use the internet. We could have customers go online, enter their orders, which are checked against the inventory database electronically, and then release the orders to the picking area. If we eliminate the paper fax altogether, then we eliminate this, and this delay right here. All of that pulls out about 4 hours out of the process and improves the yield rate substantially. The point is, then we're actually using this detailed flow chart to understand what the performance of the current process is and what we could do to make it better. We could actually do some very simple cost justification in a case like this. What I'd like you to do now is read the Omni Health Plan's mini case study and take a crack at developing a process flow chart for the receiving process. Once you've had a chance to read the mini case study and do that, come back to this lecture. Okay, here's how I map the receiving process at Omni Health Plans. First thing I want to emphasize is I'm starting with the claims being received by Omni Health Plans, so I'm setting some boundaries on this process. When a claim comes in, it really falls into one of two camps. Either it's being submitted to the Omni claim system, which means it can go through the auto check that doesn't involve people at all, or it's going to have to be manually checked. So let's say we do have an Omni claim being submitted. It goes through auto check. If it's okay, we print it out and send it on to the approval process. So they're still dealing with paper here. But that's obviously the quickest path through the system, and I have it marked in yellow. If it's not an Omni claim, then if it's electronic, that means it's come in via email. We have to print a copy and manually check it. Or if it's already coming in paper form, it's not electronic, then we still have to go through the manual check. So in any case, if you're coming through Omni claim, you have an auto check. If it's not Omni claim, then you have to go through a manual check. Now, let's assume we're in a situation where we end up doing a manual check and it's not okay. What happens then? Well, then we have to kick the claim back to the provider, and the provider corrects and resubmits the claim. And that can add substantial time to this process. In fact, it can go and be anywhere from hours to days before the claim gets resubmitted. And so you can imagine here, we want to kind of avoid this type of loop back through the system. Some of the information in the mini case study suggests that problems with claims aren't distributed evenly across different healthcare providers. For instance, some doctors' offices and hospitals are much more accurate than others. So if I want to try to eliminate the number of claims that go through this feedback loop, I might have to do some detailed investigation into where the errors are coming from, who's providing most of these errors, or who's creating most of these errors. And that's kind of looking forward to our next lecture when we talk about Six Sigma and process improvement. But for now, the key points I want to bring up here is that the ideal path through this process would be if we could get everyone to follow the OmniClaim system. Submit electronically through the logic of the OmniClaim. Alternatively, if they have to submit some other way, then at least do it accurately so we avoid the feedback loop and having to resubmit the claim. Okay, so if we look at this, what's the time through the system? If it's a perfect claim coming through OmniClaim, then really the only time in the system is what it takes to print the copy. On the other hand, what if it's a regular claim coming in through the mail and we have to manually check it and it turns out to be okay? What's the minimum time through the system? Well, it's going to be the minimum time is going to be 15 to 30 minutes. But we all know there could be a big queue of work to do. So what we don't see necessarily here is the potential buffer in front of the manual checking step, which will depend on the load of claims being processed. But at a minimum it's going to be 15 to 30 minutes. If the claim has to be resubmitted because there's problems, that's going to add substantial time to this. And by the way, just for your edification, I went ahead and mapped out the approval process as well. So if you want to take a look at both the receiving process and the approval process and see if you got something close to what I did, it's here for you. And I'd be glad to talk in more detail about this with you offline. Okay, so using flowcharts to guide improvement efforts. Here's how flowcharts help us. First of all, whenever we see a D symbol, that big delay like we saw in the Raleigh Distribution Center, we ought to be asking ourselves, what causes that delay? How long is it? How could we reduce its impact? Why are we worried about attacking delays? Well, because delays never create value. Unless we're talking about wine that has to age, delays don't buy us anything. We should also examine decision points. Is it a real decision or just a checking activity? If it's a simple checking activity, can we automate or eliminate it? And also, we should be looking for loops. Why is there a loop in the logic of the process flow? Why do we see that loop in the flow chart? Would we need the loop if we didn't have any failures, either due to quality of inputs, planning, etc.? And if you go back to the Omni Health Plans receiving process, one of our goals might be to figure out what is the cost of having to redo claims, and is it worth going through some effort to eliminate that loop? Okay. Now there's some limitations to flowcharts. Obviously they're very detailed, but they don't necessarily show us where the interaction points are between different parts of the business or outside partners. So we don't get a view of the handoffs, or we don't get an understanding of how responsibility for the entity flowing through the system is divided up across different partners. The second thing that a flowchart doesn't tell us is how the customer experiences the process. If you go back to the Raleigh Distribution Center example, the customer really wasn't involved in any of those steps, but they just felt the impact of the time. So if we're in a service environment, on the other hand, where the customer is involved in each process step or the bulk of them, then we want to be able to see that. We want to understand where those customer interface points are. And that leads us to our discussion of swim lane diagrams. Swim lane diagrams have several advantages over simple flowcharts. First of all, they are meant to show process movement of customers or information across functional areas or partners. That's what they're good at. So they show us where there's sharing or transfer of information. They show us where there's handoffs. Now, because swim lane diagrams are focusing on the movement of customers or information across boundaries, they're frequently simplified. And what users of flowcharts and swim lane diagrams will often do is use a swim lane diagram to give a higher level view of a process, but then drill down into individual boxes with flowcharts. that show the more detailed logic. Swim lane diagrams are particularly useful when communication or flow of work between areas is a potential problem and no single area owns or sees the entire process. So to put a little bit of flesh on the bones and illustrate how swim lane diagrams can provide us with benefits, I'm going to look at the example that actually comes from a colleague, and this example was his wife was being treated for breast cancer. So the patient required a lumpectomy and follow-up care. The question became then, who were the parties involved in the lumpectomy and follow-up care? What information was needed and transferred? And who was ultimately responsible for making sure the entire process was completed in a timely and error-free fashion? So what this professor did is, working with his wife, who by the way happened to be a registered nurse, they developed a simplified swim lane diagram. And first off we want to notice on the swim lane diagram is we have a different swim lane for each of the parties involved in this process. So we have the patient or the customer, we have the general practitioner, radiology, surgeon, hospital, etc., etc. So in this particular case, there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 parties. And we could probably add some additional parties or swim lanes to this. So let's see how it worked. The process started off with an appointment between the patient and the general practitioner. So they're both involved in this appointment. A physical occurred. Based on that, an appointment was made with radiology for a mammogram, which involved the patient and the radiologist. The radiologist developed the mammogram, sent a copy to the general practitioner who consulted with the patient. You know, we see a lump here, we need to think about what we're going to do about that. An appointment was then made with the surgeon to remove the lump. The surgeon scheduled orders with the hospital, and then the patient also went through consultations with a radiological oncologist and a medical oncologist. These folks being responsible for two different paths of treatment for the cancer. So already you can see the complexity of this process. The patient is having to deal with a GP, a radiologist, surgeon, a radiological oncologist, and a medical oncologist. Now, for this first part of the swim lane diagram, there was an error that occurred. The surgeon failed to order a needle locator to identify the location of the tumor. And so that's an error in how the process worked. And you know, if we think about how we might have eliminated the possibility of that, maybe there should have been some kind of check sheet or standing order in terms of what gets delivered for this type of surgery. But in any case, an error occurred. Now, continuing with this swim lane diagram, we have the patient again across the top, and we have the different parties involved. There's pre-admittance that goes on between the patient and the hospital. Now, this is a classic example of where there might be some drill down into a more detailed flow chart. Pre-admittance involves a lot of things, making sure you have the right insurance, making sure you've done all the things necessary before you arrive at the hospital. We have the surgery step involving the patient, the surgeon, the hospital. Pathology received the sample. They analyzed the sample of from the lumpectomy. They typed up the results and sent those to the radiological oncologist and the medical oncologist. Now, I want to talk about the second error. In this particular case, the pathologist received the sample coming out of the surgery. They analyzed it, and instead of typing up that the tumor was 1.6 centimeters, they typed it up as 1.6 millimeters. And that could be a significant error because the way a radiological oncologist and a medical oncologist would treat a 1.6 millimeter tumor might be very different than what they do for a 1.6 centimeter tumor. So this is an example of an error that could have actually been life-threatening. And what's ironic about this is that that second error was caught by the patient. How many patients would know enough to remember the size of the tumor? It just happened to be the case here because the patient was a registered nurse, and she caught the error. So we have this error in the process flow, and maybe what we might do is, we might think about how we can foolproof the process. So what could we have done? Why did this error occur, and why was it caught by the patient? Well, if you think about that, one thing you notice is that the results of the surgery are sent, the results of the pathology report, I should say, are sent to the radiological oncologist and the medical oncologist, but they're not sent back to the surgeon, who would have probably been the best position to notice that they had the size of the tumor written down incorrectly. So there's a logical flow in the process here. But at a more macro level, if you start looking at this entire process, who's responsible from start to finish? Is it the GP? Is it the surgeon? No one's responsible for this process from start to finish. The only person who's involved in every step of this virtually is the patient. And that's sort of like saying, should you be responsible for every step of your auto repair process, which is admittedly less complex than this. And this is one of the issues involving healthcare. Who takes responsibility for the entire process from beginning to end? Who is watching over the patient? So the swim lane diagram shows us both the complexity of a typical healthcare experience and some of the potential problems involved in it. And as such, we may start thinking about some more proactive solutions. Maybe we ought to think about having clinics where all these people are in one place, all devoted to serving patients with breast cancer. So imagine if you had all these doctors, etc., all these resources in one clinic where they could all meet at the same time with the patient. How much better would the care be? We'd have kind of a focused hospital. So there's a lot of food for thought there. Okay, so we've talked about basic flow charts, we've talked about swim lane diagrams and the pros and cons of each of those. The third approach I want to talk about is service blueprinting, and this is one you probably haven't seen. But what service blueprinting does is it takes a process and it reshuffles the activities in such a way that we understand where the customer contact points are and start thinking about how we manage those customer contact points. So it's got a very different template than what we're used to seeing. What the service blueprint does is they argue that there's points at which the customer engages directly, face-to-face as it were, with the business process. And we call this the line of interaction. We have customer actions and on-stage activities. On-stage activities are those things that involve direct interaction with the customer. Then there's backstage activities. These are service activities that do not involve direct interaction with the customer, but nevertheless occur as a direct result of specific customer actions. Think about the Omni Health Plans example. The customer, in this case, the healthcare provider, submits a claim. All this backstage activity takes place as a direct result of that, but it's not as if the folks in Omni Health Plans are across the table, as it were, from the customer or the healthcare provider when this is going on. A lot of what happens at Omni Health Plans is backstage. And we call these activities backstage because they're happening below the line of visibility. The customer doesn't see it directly. Then there's a third level of activity called support processes. And these are service processes that facilitate the execution of on-stage and backstage activities, but are not carried out due to any specific customer's actions. And they're typically carried out in advance before the customer enters the system. So think about this template for a few seconds, and then I'm going to show how we can use it to diagnose and understand a rather simple business process. Okay, the example I'm going to go with is the Bluebird Cafe. Simple situation where a customer enters a restaurant, gets served, and then they leave the restaurant. So if we look at all the different steps here, the host seats the customer, the waitress takes a drink and food orders, the waitress preps the drinks, the waitress delivers the drinks. At the same time, the waitress delivers the food order to the kitchen, which prepares the food, tells the waitress that the food is ready. The waiter picks up and delivers the food and prepares a check, delivers a check, cashier processes the check, and then the customer leaves. So it looks like a pretty boring process. Now, when we look at it in this classic flowchart format, we really don't have a lot of good information or insights to what's going on at this restaurant, or we certainly don't have a way to think about this process in depth. But I'm taking the same example and I'm going to reshuffle it in such a way that we can understand how the customer interacts with the staff and what support activities are required to carry out the onstage and backstage activities. So here we go. Okay, first of all, I started to think about what are the boxes I showed before represented customer activities. Okay, well, we have the customer entering the restaurant, they place an order, they receive their drinks, they receive their food, they receive the check, and they give the check to the cashier. So these are all things that the customer is expected to do. For every one of these customer actions, we have an on-stage action. That is something that's being carried out by the business. The host is seating the customer. The waitress is taking their drink and food orders. They're delivering the drinks, they're picking up and delivering the food, they're delivering the check, and then the cashier is processing his check. So I start thinking about these sets of activities here and how I can design them in such a way to improve the customer experience or at a minimum prevent errors from occurring. So let's take this first one here. Customer enters the restaurant and host seats the customer. What kind of rules might I follow? Hey, if it's a couple, I'm not going to sit them next to a family. If it's a family, I'm going to try to sit them away from other people, especially if they have small kids who might throw food. If I'm looking at the second step here about taking the drink and food orders, how can I ensure that I get that information correct and don't make errors? How can I make sure I deliver the right food to the right person at the table, et cetera, et cetera. So I can think about how I design these on-stage activities in such a way that that line of interaction takes place seamlessly without any errors. Now, what about these backstage activities? These are things that are happening as a result of the customer coming in the door, but the customer doesn't necessarily see us preparing the drinks or cooking the food, etc. So that's why we call them backstage. And again, I might think about what needs to take place for these to be carried out correctly. Now I have a whole new set of activities showing up on this diagram that weren't in the one before, and we call these support processes. Take, for instance, a seating system. Any of you who have ever worked as a hostess or a host in a restaurant realize there's certain rules that are followed to try to balance the workload across waiters or waitresses and to group out people according to what their different requirements are. So if we have a good seating system in place, and if that logic's been developed ahead of time, then that's going to help us do a better job when we're actually seating the customer. Let's look at a more meaty example, the kitchen staffing system. If we don't think carefully in advance about what mix of skills are needed in the kitchen at certain times and how many personnel are needed in the kitchen, then when it comes time to prepare the food, we may not have the right number of people or the right skill set to do it. So for instance, as an example, if you're serving sushi, then you better have a kitchen staffing system that makes sure you have the right, correctly trained staff for preparing sushi. So this is an example of where support processes, if they're not done well ahead of time, can undermine our ability to carry out the backstage actions or the onstage actions. So again, how does the service blueprint benefit us? I start thinking about in detail how each one of these interactions between the customer and our process is carried out. How can I improve that? How can I make it better? I start thinking about what support processes have to be in place to make sure my backstage and onstage actions can be carried out properly as well. So I start thinking about the systems design from a somewhat higher level. So the service blueprinting benefits, we get a clear understanding of where the interaction points are. Visible versus invisible activities, online versus offline activities. Offline, those are the support activities we do. And we can ask ourselves, how can we error-proof on-stage and backstage activities? Questions to consider in your business: what are examples of on-stage, backstage, and support activities in your organization, and where does most of the activity take place? If most of the activity is taking place on stage, then that has implications for the type of personnel you have in your organization. If the vast majority of activities are taking backstage or in the support realm, that has other implications. So to summarize, in this first lecture in our business process design and analysis section of the course, I talked about the domain of business process management. The business process level is where we're going to be spending most of the time in this course. But there's also an enterprise level where we address strategic issues, where we think about the business process architecture and how all the different individual business processes fit together, where we think about performance measurement systems and governance of those processes. And there's also an implementation level where we have to think about the set of HR skills and the set of IT requirements necessary to support our business processes. Obviously, that model that I discussed that was put forth by Paul Harmon could be a course in and of itself, and I encourage you to read on about that if you're interested. The second major topic area was process mapping. There's many different approaches to process mapping. We just have to understand which approach is right given the business situation at hand. If I need to understand the detailed logic either for control or certification purposes or to diagnose problems, flowcharts are ideally suited to that. They're the most detailed type of process map. Swim lane maps, in contrast, help us understand when processes cross functional boundaries or involve different individuals. The example we had from the lumpectomy of a patient showed how treating breast cancer involves a myriad of different partners and potential handoffs. And we start thinking through that type of map of how do we eliminate possible errors and handoffs, or how do we redesign the process completely to avoid the types of flows we saw in that example and the types of errors we saw. Finally, service blueprinting turns process mapping on its head and says, let's look at it from the context of the customer. There's a line of visibility. There's a line of interaction. There's support activities that happen offline in the background. So all three of these different process mapping approaches have their strengths as well as their weaknesses.